The purpose of the Friday Facebook Live with the legal experts is to help you with your legal questions. We've seen a lot of changes coming in the US with the Visa Bulletin, with the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act, and we're very happy to have Chris with us because he is the expert in that area. So Chris, before we get to some of the already posted questions, the first one that we have is from Chris Borgia, who's asking about the 221G situation. And I wonder if you can shed some light on that for us.
Yeah, I think I can. So just for those of you who aren't familiar, nurses historically, when their I-140s are approved and their priority dates are current, they go to embassies, Manila obviously being the most heavily used one. And there's some background checks and a few other administrative processes that are done there at the U.S. Embassy in Manila. But ordinarily, then the visa is issued shortly after the interview is over. Starting in December of this year and through the end of February, we saw as an industry, and that was whether you were going to Kinetics or going with another recruiter, whether I was your attorney or any of the attorneys, it was across the board. Nearly every nurse who went for an interview in that December, January, February timeframe received a 221G letter. And the 221G letter was issued somewhat oddly, in fact, very oddly. It was very unprecedented that we went from a universe where nearly 100% of the visas were approved to nearly 100% of the visas received these 221Gs. Towards early March, I was aware, and a lot of other attorneys I think were aware, that conversations were happening with the Department of State. I didn't have any particularly myself, but I was working with some folks who were. And the Department of State in early March let it be known amongst the lawyer community that the problem was solved with what was happening at the 221Gs in Manila. That's the good news. However, the Department of State officials that I was interacting with did not go as far as to say that there was necessarily something wrong between December, January, and February, and that's certainly their prerogative. Having said that, it's pretty uncommon for an official in Washington, D.C. to directly say that some of its lower level employees maybe did something wrong. But we were given the impression in early March that the 221G problem is solved on a going forward basis. Now, is that true? On one hand, I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because from March through really now, there have been very few visa appointments held in Manila because of two reasons, really. One, in February, the Visa Bulletin retrogressed back, and that meant that a lot of folks who might have ordinarily been able to get their visa appointments couldn't because they were no longer current. And for a second reason, the COVID crisis obviously kicked in mid-March, and the embassies in Manila, the embassy in Manila and around the world, they all shut down and they're really only open for emergency reasons. So for the last 3 months, no one has actually, virtually no one, has been able to obtain a visa appointment for those two reasons. And so I guess the first takeaway of this is that my impression is that once the embassies start opening up in June and into July and the visa appointments for new cases get scheduled, that I expect that we will see those visas issued and that this 221G phenomenon that happened in December, January, and February will go away. Now, I can't say that's for sure. This is just what I've been told, and I want to be clear, what I'm hearing is really secondhand. It's not my primary communication, but I am hearing it through multiple channels and from multiple people that I talk with that are connected with the State Department. So that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway is, what about all the folks who were issued 221Gs in the December, January, and February timeframe? And what we're really doing here at our office is we're putting those into sort of two categories. The first category is some of those folks were issued 221Gs and their cases were actually sent back to the Nebraska or Texas Service Center. And then the second category is another group of nurses were issued 221Gs, but their cases remain at the embassy in Manila. And so if you're in this group of December, January, and February 221G cases, the first thing you want to try and figure out is, was your case sent back to the USCIS Service Center, or is your case still sitting in Manila? If it's still sitting in Manila, we are working with our clients to liaise with that embassy in Manila. We're actually not going to start this till after June 1 because and into June, because the embassies aren't quite open just quite yet. And so there's no point flooding them with emails because you're just not going to get answered. In fact, the few emails that we've sent over the last 3 months, almost all of them a few weeks later, we just get a stock email back from the embassy just simply saying, we're busy, we're closed, we're only handling emergency issues. So what I would say is, if you think that you are current and you think that your case is still at the embassy in Manila, work with your lawyer in order to contact the embassy to try and shake that case free for another interview, or ideally to just get the visa issued. And so that's the plan. Whether that works or not, we will be a lot smarter in about 30 days after the embassy is open. If your case was sent back to the service center, you can still do that, try to contact Manila, but I suspect you are going to receive an email back from the Manila embassy saying that your visa was refused and your case has been sent back to the service center. And then you're going to have to work with your attorney and your U.S. employer and your recruiter and maybe even get some congressional support, because what we're going to have to do is get the service centers to reissue the approval notice to send it back to Manila in order to get the visa ultimately issued. So that's it. Those are your three categories. You're either, you have an I-140 that's about to become current that actually hasn't gone to the embassy, and we are cautiously optimistic that your visas will be issued this summer. Second category, a 221G was issued, but your case was not sent back to the service center, in which case we're suggesting you work with the embassy in order to try and get your visa reissued, your visa appointment reissued. Third category, your case was sent back to the service center. You can try to reach out to the embassy, but I suspect they're going to tell you that your case has been sent back and there's just nothing administratively they can do right now, in which case you'll need to work with the service center to get the I-140 reapproved and sent back upstream up to the embassy.
Okay. Thank you for that, Chris. I think that was a really clear, very, very clear answer to the question. And I think hopefully that will help a lot of people that have been caught in this unfortunate situation. It's a very difficult and frustrating process, and what happened in Manila, added a whole nother layer of frustration. Then you put on that the visa bulletin plus COVID, just incredibly nightmarish situation for people who've waited so long. So thank you for that answer, because I think that gives a lot of clarity. If anybody's watching who's in that situation or knows of somebody who's in that situation, please make sure that they have heard this advice from Chris Musello. I think that was really great advice, very clear, very concise, and giving us at least a path to action for anyone in this unfortunate circumstance. So thank you for that. So Chris, just one thing that you mentioned is you said getting congressional assistance. Do you want to just talk about that just for a minute or two, just what that would mean? Because maybe somebody listening is working with a lawyer that they're not sure what that means. Can you maybe just go into that a little bit more detail?
Sure, yeah. What we sometimes do with problematic cases where the government is sort of taking a lot of time, A, and then B, it's particularly acute right now because if your visa priority date is current, the State Department does have a notice on their website that healthcare workers are essential workers, and the State Department would like those cases to be expedited. And so what we do in our office from time to time, fortunately we don't do it too often, is we work with the local senator or congressman in that state. And so for instance, if you were going to a hospital in, California, maybe where Tanya's at, we would work with the House member who's in the same district as the hospital, and we would also work with the two senators in California. They happen to be the senators in California, Harris and Feinstein, and we work with their offices to contact the Texas Service Center or the Nebraska Service Center in order to try and get the case shaken free. And so that's how that process works. It's best if we can work with the hospital. The senators' offices and the House members' offices are much more likely to respond to an inquiry that we're making on behalf of the hospital, especially if there's several cases, so we can try and attack all of those cases at once. They're not likely to help you if you're just a non-U.S. citizen who's overseas, or I shouldn't say they're not likely to help you, but it's not going to be as much of a priority for them. Whereas if we can get a hospital involved and get someone at the hospital to work with us on that, not only that, but often the hospitals actually have relationships with those offices for other reasons that aren't even immigration related. And so there may be some connections there that we can work with in order to try and shake those cases free.
Yeah. So that's very important for anybody who's listening. If you have this kind of situation happen, and as Chris said, you have the three options, the three paths that are available. It's important that you speak to the lawyer who's working on your case and see if you can get some congressional support. We have had, well, not in terms of this particular 221G situation, but we had an instance a while ago where a nurse, she had a previous priority date, and the USCIS didn't recapture that previous priority date. And the lawyer and the hospital were able to work together with the senator's office, and that's how they were able to actually get that correction made. So that is a way of sometimes, as Chris says, shaking it free. And it's really important. That's really the purpose of these HWRA Facebook Lives, because we want to ensure that we give you accurate information to help you where you need it. Okay, so we're going to move on. Let me just see here. So we have Cheryl is watching, Maricon, Leuven is in the UAE. Predictions for this upcoming visa bulletin. Chris, we had a good month. We were doing the happy dance, 10-month jump. Any predictions for the coming months?
So I know everyone always wants to hear predictions, and I'm certainly going to make some because got to serve the audience, Tanya.
Yeah.
But
go ahead, Chris. Thousands of people watching you, Chris, as you make a prediction.
Yeah. No, and I understand why, because everyone's trying to plan more than 30 days in advance. So it's completely sensible. But I want to just start by saying that it's hard to make predictions when things are normal. With the coronavirus COVID-19 situation, it just adds a lot more difficulty. And so these are predictions. This is my best guess. Having said that, I want to put that qualifier on it, that it is difficult. So we did, as Tanya said, for the June visa bulletin, it moved 10 months, which is a big jump. It went from January to October of 17. It's tempered a little bit by that many of the nurses who had priority dates during that time frame probably are already in the United States. But I do know we've had a dozen or 2 dozen in our office that actually fell into that 10-month period. So that was great news, maybe even more. So where are we going? July, August, September. Those are the last 3 months of the fiscal year. So the visa bulletin is designed so that there are 140,000 visas. That's not the visa bulletin. That's the statute. That's the law. And then what the visa bulletin tries to do is it tries to have the visas flow out in a month-by-month basis, so that the 140,000th visa is used in August or September. And the reason why they're trying to get the 140,000th visa in August or September is because the U.S. fiscal year ends on September 30th, and then it starts anew again on October 1st. And so the State Department could, on October, throw open the visa bulletin and have 140,000 visas issued in October, and then they'd have 11 months where there'd be nothing to do at the embassies, and so that's not a very smart way to do it. And so they flow the visas out, they stagger the visas out on a month-by-month basis all year. As we get closer, and so what happens is what happened in February, where the visa bulletin for Philippine EB3 and Worldwide EB3 dramatically jumped back, is that was essentially the State Department's way of saying that the flow of visas in October, November, December, and January had been too fast. And so the State Department was using up that allotment of 140,000 visas too quickly. And in February, they essentially turned off the spigot, if you will, by moving it back to January of 2007. Coronavirus kept that spigot basically jammed shut. So that was February, March, April, May. Now we've seen the June visa bulletin, and they've turned it back on a little bit again. My sense is because there have been so few visas issued over the last 3 or 4 months, Tanya, that I think we are going to see that spigot come back on. The flow is going to move forward again in the next few months. And so my prediction is we are going to see that visa number move up pretty dramatically over the next 2 and 3 months. Now, is pretty dramatic mean that it moves into 2020? Probably not. Maybe, but probably not. Could it move into 2018? I think very much so. Could it move into 2019? Perhaps. So I do think we're going to see a progression of both EB3 and worldwide here in July and the August visa bulletin.
Okay, well, you heard it here directly from Chris Marcello himself on HWRA. The future seems bright, and we're hoping that that prediction will come true. So keep watching, everybody, and we'll keep you posted. The next question, and I see the clock is ticking, so I'm going to move quickly on to the next question. Marcia Lynn has asked a very topical question about the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act. And I think really important to talk about that act, what it means, where it is in Congress, and Chris really is an expert in that area. So I'm really grateful to have you here, Chris, and to share this information with so many people. I actually was just thinking as we were talking that just to share with everybody, Chris and I did a webinar for hundreds of clients this week in the US on this particular act. And you know, people are really interested in it, and we are working very hard behind the scenes, everybody involved here in the US, to try and get to educate the clients, the hospitals and the nursing homes and the rehab centers, etc., about this particular bill in Congress, so that they can get behind it and can lend their support to the senators and the House representatives. But I'm actually just thinking, Chris, I might actually just share the some of the slides that we had, and you can maybe talk that through with everybody. I think that could be really helpful. Please remember, everybody, as I'm sharing this with you, Chris will talk you through these slides, but please make sure to share this with your friends and colleagues. This is really important information for you to understand, because if this bill comes into play, which we will hopefully know in just a few weeks, and if it is positive, it's going to be a fast track and a way of expediting green cards for nurses. Can you see the slides, Chris?
Yes, no, I can see it on my screen, so I suspect everybody can.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so Tanya and I did a call with some of her clients the other day, earlier this week, and so this was a slide that I put together for that. And so these, I think, are some of the most important points if you're starting to learn about the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act. So this is a bill that was introduced into the U.S. Congress a few weeks ago, early May. And there we go. And
there we go. Sorry.
That's it. Yeah. And so in order to get a bill passed in the United States, you have to have support in the U.S. Senate, and you have to have support in the U.S. Congress. And just in 3 weeks, we have had an enormous amount of support. We have about 20 of the 100 senators in the United States Senate have already agreed to co-sponsor the bill. That means they're essentially saying up front that they are in favor of this bill. And not only are they in favor of this bill, but they are helping to try and attract more senators to support the bill. And we have had 26 out of about 420 or 430 or so House members, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually quite a bit. Even more impressive, the mix of the 20 senators and the 26 or 28 House members is bipartisan. There are two main political parties here in the U.S., the Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats are what were President Obama's party, and the Republicans are current President Trump's party. And as you might imagine, if you follow any of the U.S. politics, those two groups do not agree on much. But in this bill, we have a 50-50 breakdown of both Democrats and Republicans, both in the U.S. House and the Senate. So that's bipartisan, and that is very encouraging for us. So that's all the good news on the process. The bill, I think if it's going to be passed, we're going to know this summer. It's either going to be passed or it's not going to be passed. I'm saying roughly by about the end of July. And that's because by the end of July, the U.S. Congress is going to go on their summer break. They're going to be out until early to mid-September. And then the U.S. Presidential election, which is President Trump versus Vice President Biden, who was the vice president under Obama, they'll have their election in November. And traditionally, no real legislation goes in September and October before a U.S. presidential election. So again, I think we'll know everything by the end of July. It's going to be just in the next maybe 2 months or so. So that's the first reason, because of just sort of the calendar. The second reason why I think it's going to happen by the end of July is this bill is really targeted to helping U.S. patients during the COVID-19 crisis. And the COVID-19 crisis is here and now, but hopefully it's not going to last forever. And so for those two reasons, I think we will know if this bill succeeds or fails in the next 2 months by the end of July. So that's the process. In terms of likelihood, it's hard to predict likelihood on legislation. I can tell you this, though. I've been going to Washington, D.C. To advocate for legislation, often in the healthcare area, for about 17 or 18 years. And this bill has more support than any bill that I've ever worked on. And I've actually been part of groups that have actually had bills not just be introduced, but have actually passed and been signed into law. Most notably, back in 2005, we had a bill very similar to this Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act in 2005. And, I was a small part of that effort, and that bill actually didn't even have as much support as this bill. So that's all reason for optimism, but this is by no means a sure thing. We need to continue to build up support of senators and House members, and we've had a very excellent May here, and hopefully we can continue that into June. Okay, so what does the bill do? I'm going to talk specifically about nurses, although there is an analog provision, as you can see, for doctors. But for a nurse, and if you're a nurse in the Philippines or anywhere else around the world, here's what it means. We think there's a backlog of retrogressed nurses. We don't even think that. We know that's obviously true. In fact, maybe many of you who are listening in on this session, all of the nurses who are currently retrogressed, whether they're Indian nationals, Philippine nationals, or any other country, if this bill passes, you will get a retrogression-free visa. And really, if this bill passes and you have your I-140 already approved, you will just simply have to go through the NVC process, and you will have to schedule an appointment at the embassy in your home country. And the only constraint to that will just simply be the embassy in your home country's capacity to actually schedule visas. There's obviously going to be a very high demand, and the embassies are, often very overworked. And so they're just going to have to schedule them week by week and month by month. And frankly, if this bill passes, it doesn't matter if your visa appointment is scheduled in June or your visa appointment is scheduled in December of this year, or even into next year, conceivably. Your visa is, once this bill passes, your visa is protected and is retrogression free at any time that you go to your visa appointment. The expectation, of course, is that the vast majority of these nurses would come in this year in 2020. Not only that, but any nurse whose petition is filed up until a date that I'll explain in a minute, she would also get a retrogression-free visa. And by the way, anytime I'm talking about the nurse's visa, their family members, which are spouses and any children who are under 21 at the day of the visa appointment, will also get a visa. So again, any nurse who is filed anytime after this bill is passed will also get a retrogression-free visa. Again, even if that visa appointment isn't until later on this year or conceivably even into 2021. Again, our expectation is that the vast bulk of these nurses would be able to come in this year, in 2020. Now, we are only allowed to use 25,000 of these visas. We do not believe the retrogression has more than 10 or 15,000 current nurses in it, and that is inclusive of all Indians, Filipinos, and all other countries. There's been some talk on the internet. People are concerned that there maybe are 25,000 Indian nurses in the pipeline. There's no data to support that whatsoever. So you should, anyone who's writing that, if you read that, you should just mute them and no longer continue to follow them, because they are just, they're talking uneducated, and with there's enough of that on the internet, you don't need to hear it. Now, the only thing is there's this 25,000 visa cap. The other cap is that this bill is also tied to something called an emergency declaration. President Trump put out an emergency declaration in March. That emergency declaration essentially says that the president believes that the U.S. is in a crisis situation because of COVID-19, and therefore he has declared an emergency, and that allows the president to do some things, to have some powers that he would not ordinarily be allowed to have. And in the U.S. system, and frankly a lot of systems around the world, presidents and leaders, prime ministers, et cetera, are allowed to issue these emergency declarations from time to time during times of crises, and it's very normal. And so the president issued that on March 15th or so, the week of March 15th. And so here we are at the end of May, and that remains in effect. At some point, the president will declare the emergency is over. He will say, okay, I believe that we are past the worst of this COVID-19 crisis. I don't know if he's going to say that next week, June 1st, or I don't know if he's going to say that 6 months from now. He may not even know. He's probably going to see how the COVID-19 situation evolves over the next few weeks and months. But whenever he says that, this bill falls away 90 days later. But I want to be clear. All that means is that new nursing petitions that are filed no longer get the advantage of a retrogression-free visa. Once this bill is signed into law, even if the president in June, so let's use this example. If on June 1st, the president declares the emergency declaration over, we count forward 90 days, that takes us to September 1st. That means that any I-140 that's filed between now and September 1st, or even earlier, gets a retrogression-free visa, even if their visa appointment is in October or November or December or even into January of next year. It doesn't really matter when the visa appointment happens. It only matters when your I-140 is filed. And so that's how the process works. We exempt the visas from the per country cap, which is the second bullet point. All that really means is that if by some chance we get close to that 25,000 quota that they are supposed to, the State Department is supposed to prioritize in the order of priority date without reference to what country you were born in. The third point is that it recaptures green card visas. That's a technical point that probably just isn't worth getting into. But that's where we are acquiring the pool of visas, and it importantly says that we are not changing the visa quotas. We are just doing this one-time allotment of visas. It does have some provisions to ask the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State to fast-track these visas, and so that's important. So you can expect that if you're going to file your I-140, that your I-140 would move quickly, and you can expect that the NVC process and the embassy appointments, they should prioritize these above other occupational visas. And then this is important, and I know when we were putting this bill together, this was something that everybody, all the senators felt was very important. There is in this country, and in probably a lot of other countries, maybe the country where you're viewing, there have been some furloughs of nurses in America over the course of April and May. And U.S. hospitals, as much as they value overseas nurses, the first people that they want to hire are local American nurses. And so this bill says that no one under this visa is allowed to work in a facility if that facility continues to have furloughs and layoffs of U.S. workers in nursing. So, if by some chance the hospital has furloughed someone in their IT department, that would not impact this. But if a hospital is currently furloughing or laying off a U.S. nurse, then they are not allowed to use this visa. They are not allowed to sponsor you for this visa. Frankly, it's our expectation that is, even though there have been some furloughs and layoffs in April and May, that is going to disappear, is our expectation here, into June and July as the U.S. healthcare system starts to take on more and more patients. In our country, and probably where you are, frankly, in April and May, U.S. hospitals were actually a little underutilized. There were actually fewer patients than anyone expected because a lot of the hospitals and facilities were waiting to see this bulk of American patients come in with COVID. And frankly, that didn't happen to the volume that everyone expected it to, which is good. I mean, it's probably good because it means that people are a little healthier than expected. I think the hospitals, under an abundance of caution, which was probably a very smart move, made sure that they had the capacity in case this COVID-19 bubbled up, but that didn't happen. And so now other types of elective surgeries, knee replacements, hip replacements, heart surgeries, et cetera, that had been postponed in April and May are now starting to happen in June and July. And so we do think that those furloughs of American nurses, that was a very short 1 or 2 month phenomenon, and we think that is. If by some chance it's not, then again, these hospitals are going to recruit the nurse in their neighborhood before they're going to recruit overseas. I think for the Filipino and other nurses who are listening to this, there are still going to be plenty of jobs here in the United States. And so it just will mean that you're not going to go to a hospital where there's been a furlough of American nurses. But again, I want to be clear, no one honestly believes that there's going to be any sort of even middle term, forget long-term layoff of American nurses or furlough of American nurses. That seems to be, by all accounts, a very localized and particular situation just in April and May. So those are the key points of the act, then, Tanya.
Yeah, thank you so much for going through that, Chris, and giving all of that detail. I think the last point that you said is an important one from the American hospital and nursing home, the American facilities perspective, and that is that they want to make sure that they're not going to displace any American workers, especially nurses, of course. And I think that's really where this legislation is shown to be really sensible legislation and very positive legislation. We have a lot of questions about it, and we're kind of out of time, but I'm just going to show the next slide, which shows, as of Friday last week, the bipartisan support, which I think is really important, that bipartisan support, because it's not just slanted one way or the other from a political perspective, and hopefully that list will be growing soon. And the other area that I'm also...
Yeah, you can see on that list, Tanya, all the R's and D's. That means Republican or Democrat. If you just scan through the list, you'll see almost every time there's an R, there's immediately a D, and then there's an R and a D. And so that shows that it's bipartisan, both from President Trump's Republican Party and Obama's Democrat.
And the Democrats. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. And the last slide then is just to show is that there are many organizations in the US that are supporting this, namely the American Hospital Association, the National Rural Health Association, Leading Age, which is really representing all of the nursing homes, long-term care, skilled nursing facilities. So there's a CGFNS, Alliance for Ethical Recruitment Practices. So there's a lot of support from within the US from many different organizations. We have gone over time. So I really wanted to thank Chris for sharing and illuminating us with such insightful information, really good advice. So I think that hopefully this will be very helpful for many people watching. I see we have a lot of people watching, so thank you so much for joining us. Maricon, Leah, Marceline, Sharina, Christine, Jeff. Oh, Jeff is saying he's watching from Dubai. Switch the screen from Swoosh. So just a reminder to everybody, if you have not yet passed your IELTS exam, please join the Kinetics, the free Kinetics IELTS support group. It is a way for you to gain information, gain pointers and tips, free classes. Everything is absolutely free to help you to get your IELTS, because as I always say, no IELTS, no USA. So as Chris has let us know, there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of positivity. We're cautiously optimistic right now. Make sure that you get practicing on your IELTS. We need to re-energize that process. And if you have not yet passed the NCLEX exam, I would suggest that you are seriously looking at that right now, because it looks like there's going to be a great opportunity coming up. We are hopeful. So I think that is it for today. Chris, any last thoughts?
No. Just hope that everybody stays safe, and we will do this again, I'm sure, in a couple of weeks on a Facebook Friday.
Absolutely. Thank you again to the LaFora team, to Louise, Jean, Paul, Nikki, everybody on the LaFora team for giving us this opportunity. And we will be back in 1 month. In the meantime, stay safe and have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.